for just a little bit. Welcome to everyone this evening, and thank you for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to join me to talk a little bit about anxiety. I thought I'd talk a little bit about who I am and what I do. My name is Sheila Stinnett. I am a licensed professional counselor. I have worked in the Edmond community really close to 20 years. Here at the agency, we do individual and family counseling services. We do on-call crisis counseling services for families in our community. That'd be a walk-in crisis or telephone crises. We provide referral services. We send counselors out into the schools to host a wide variety and facilitate a wide variety of different types of programs. We work closely with the Edmond Juvenile Court as well to help kiddos that might be and families that might be struggling as well. And so I am by no means a master in the subject of childhood anxiety, but I deal with it on a day-to-day basis. And so I thought today we'd start and would talk a little bit about what anxiety is. We'd talk a little bit about how we might implement strategies within your family. If you know someone within your family system that was struggling with anxiety, or maybe in your neighborhood, some strategies you might be able to share with anxiety. And then I will open it up for questions toward the end. Please feel free if you have a question at any time as we go along. You can always just click mute off and ask your question, or if you type it into the chat box and I miss it, I'll try to watch it as I go along, but sometimes I'll miss it in the chat box. So where we're going to start out our conversation today, I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint. I'm going to share my screen. We're going to start off here on my title slide. I have my email address. So if there's a question that you have that you would rather not share openly this evening, or over the course of the week or the weekend, you have a question, you can always email me at this address at the agency, and I would be happy to answer your question. But where we're going to begin tonight is we're going to begin with a general discussion about what is anxiety. We hear it all the time. It's on the news. It's in all the print media that we read. Currently, in our current pandemic situation, anxiety and anxiety related disorders are fresh on everyone's mind. Everyone is struggling right now a little bit with anxiety. And so we'll start out with what we call the American Psychological Association's definition of anxiety, and how the American Psychological Association defines anxiety. It defines it as an emotion that's characterized by feelings of tension, worried thoughts, and physical changes like increased blood pressure. And I think the important thing when we're focused on what anxiety is, we have to kind of talk about it doesn't just affect one part of the individual who's struggling. It affects them physically, it affects their mental processes as well. So it is a all-encompassing disorder that when people struggle with, it impacts lots of different areas of an individual's life. Now, that was a clinical definition of anxiety, but if we talk about what anxiety actually may feel like, sometimes it's very different from clinical definitions. I love this example of anxiety. People talk about living with anxiety is like being followed by a voice. It knows all your insecurities and it uses them against you. It gets the point that it's the loudest voice in the room, the only one that you can hear. And I think that's really important when we talk about anxiety, how overwhelmed people can become that are struggling with symptoms of anxiety. Oftentimes they feel alone, they feel isolated, they feel so overwhelmed are a lot of times the way that people might define or identify feelings of anxiety. Other feelings of anxiety that when I work with families or individuals that people have talked about, sometimes people will say it feels like that I'm on a roller coaster that I can't get off of, that my body is going through all these sensations, but there's no actual event to tie it to. Other feelings that are described would be feelings of being constantly uncomfortable in our skin, on edge, maybe a feeling of hypervigilance. Other times it's like, someone might say it's like walking through a minefield. You're waiting for the next bad thing to happen, the next negative event to occur. So, although we have a clinical definition, oftentimes when people talk about or describe anxiety, they'll describe it in ways that are not like the definition itself. So I'm going to talk about some facts about anxiety, just so we can kind of understand how prevalent it is. Anxiety is actually the most common mental health disorder in the United States. It impacts about 18% or so of adults, or about 40 million people at any given time. And it's estimated that more than 30 million or 30% of us in the United States have struggled with some type of anxiety disorder over the course of our lives. In 2020, about 4.4 million children aged 3 to 17 were actually struggle with symptomology so significant they were actually diagnosed with anxiety or an anxiety-related disorder. Anxiety is most commonly reported among women. And that's not uncommon for that statistic to be in any mental health diagnosis that we're talking about. Women tend to be more open about sharing. It's not that men in our society don't struggle with anxiety. Oftentimes they're not as open to discussing it. When we talk about the severity of anxiety symptoms, about 43% of people that struggle with anxiety will report some type of mild symptomology. So they may struggle with a little bit with their thinking, or and they may have some minor physical symptoms. About a little over 33% will report a more moderate level of anxiety. And then 22% may report feeling extreme anxiety symptoms or significant anxiety symptoms, such as panic attacks, intense anxiety to the point that they may struggle to be functional and go to work, or go to school, or even be able to leave their house. Sometimes anxiety symptoms can get so significant that that occurs. Of individuals who have been diagnosed with anxiety disorders, phobias are the #1 diagnosable disorder. And a phobia is any sort of fear that we have to the point that it gets dysfunctional. For instance, my mother struggles with arachnophobia, or the fear of spiders. When I was growing up, there was an incident where we were traveling from my home in the country into town, and a very small spider, it was you almost can see it dropped down from the windshield. And my mom went off the road and into the ditch. My father was even like, what was it? Was it huge? Was it big? And we were like, we can't even find it. But in her mind, when it dropped from the windshield, she had an over-encompassing fear and kind of froze up in that moment. Other highly diagnosed anxiety disorders might be social anxiety, where individuals do not like being in large crowds or around large groups of people. Generalized anxiety disorder is kind of typified by a multitude of revolving type triggers. It could be I feel triggered when I'm in the school environment, not necessarily when I'm around other kids, but more just trying to get my work completed. And then panic disorders. And any type of panic disorder would be someone that's really struggling with panic attacks. And so their symptomology is so significant that oftentimes that their body will physically shut down. They may hyperventilate. They may shake. They may become very nauseous. So their symptomology is physical to the point that it's become dysfunctional. Anxiety rates appear to be on the rise. I'm sure that's not surprising to anybody at this point. But however, what surprised when I was working on my presentation, what was surprising to me was that anxiety rates were on the rise prior to this current COVID situation that we were in. If we look way back into the end of 2019, the first month of 2020, anxiety was up 5 percentage points from the previous year, and that's prior to the current pandemic that we were in. Millennials tend to identify as the most anxious generation. And once again, I think that may be skewed a little bit due to some of our older generations, especially when I look at my parents not being as open to talking about mental health related issues, and kind of the stigma that might be involved in them. And this is really sad to me. Anxiety is a very, very treatable disorder. But that being said, only about a little bit more than 35% of individuals that are struggling with anxiety ever reach out for help. And so there's a lot of ways that we might be able to assist and help someone with anxiety related symptoms, but often we don't get that chance because they don't step forward and discuss their current situation. I can't talk about anxiety without talking about our fight, flight, or freeze response. Our fight, flight, or freeze response is our brain's amazing way that it tries to keep us alive in crisis situations. For instance, in this slide of a bear, if I'm walking through the woods and I come upon this bear, when my eyes see the bear, my brain will start to, well, it's a bear. It looks like it might be a brown bear. And I might be able to analyze the bear at a distance. But once the bear starts turning toward me and chasing me, then my brain is going to go in the fight, flight, or freeze response. My eyes are going to go, Sheila, it's a bear. It runs. And what's going to happen deep in my limbic system in my brain, my amygdala and a couple other organs will cause the release of two of what we call our stress chemicals. It would be adrenaline and cortisol. Adrenaline we think of as our flight chemical because adrenaline in high doses gets us ready to run. It elongates muscle fibers in our body. It actually allows our red blood cells to take on more oxygen. It expands our lungs to process that oxygen. And so adrenaline is pumping the body up to run. The other chemical we talked about is cortisol. We don't know as much about cortisol, but what we've learned has been in the past 30 to 40 years or so. But what we know about cortisol is this: in high doses, cortisol causes us to have tunnel vision. So we can't see the big picture of things. Cortisol also in high doses tends to mess with time. We don't know if we've been in a crisis situation a few minutes and it feels like it's been hours, or we've been there hours and it feels like a few minutes. And it also tends to make us stronger than we normally would be. I grew up in a world where we did not have car seats. Sad to say, that tells you how old I am. And so my mother, when we would come to stop signs, would reach her mother arm out to stop us. And there have been times that she stopped a sliding kid just in that moment. Her arm shot out and she had a dose of cortisol. She could stop us in that moment. And so our fight, flight, or freeze response is a very important brain response that we have as long as we're getting chased by a bear. But the problem is our brain doesn't understand a big stressor from a little stressor. So I don't know if I'm getting chased by a bear or if I'm working on a 50-question math test. My brain just knows I'm in fight, flight, or freeze. Actually, freeze is a recent addition. What researchers noticed is in a certain segment of the population, when adrenaline and cortisol levels get so high, people will report feeling paralyzed. I couldn't move, I couldn't talk, I was just frozen. If you've ever watched a scary movie and you said to yourself, why did that person stand there and get eaten by the monster? It's because the director is trying to show you they are in fight, flight, or freeze. That adrenaline and cortisol levels are so high, individuals cannot function. If we look at it at a brain level, at a fight, flight, or freeze at a brain level, what we're really looking at is the relationship between our survival brain, that in this slide is the red area, which would be our brain stem, and that relationship to the green part of our brain, our rational brain, our neocortex. And there in the middle, there's our emotional brain, our limbic system. And so when we encounter a stressor, be it a spelling test or being chased by a bear, what the emotional brain does is it tries to get a handle on the situation. It says, ooh, I feel like the body is in crisis. And so then basically when it has that experience, it shuts off our rational brain, our neocortex, and it sends all the chemicals and everything, all the activity to the survival part of the brain. And so, which is great if I'm being chased by a bear, not so great if I'm just trying to get through word 17 on my spelling test. The interesting thing, sometimes you'll hear it talked about now, the downstairs part of the brain and the upstairs part of the brain. And the limbic system is the doorway between the downstairs part of our brain, our survival brain, our fight, flight, or freeze response, and that rational brain, our frontal cortex. And when a person's triggered, they can't, it's very difficult for them to be in both parts, their rational brain and their survival brain. Typically, they will go in their survival brain without rationale for the situation, which makes sense if I'm being chased by a bear. If I'm being chased by a bear, I don't want to stop and say, oh, that bear looks like it weighs 600 pounds and it looks like it might have just eaten salmon. It might not want to eat me. Or if I start running, I don't need to be stopping to think, oh, I think bears run 30 miles an hour. Maybe I can't outrun it. So the survival brain takes up for that. I become more reactive and less proactive. And so when we talk about different strategies to reduce anxiety, what we're really talking about are strategies where we can open up and be able to access that rational brain part of ourselves. Interestingly enough, the body has been created to deal with different degrees of stress. For instance, all of us are fully capable and able to deal with what we call positive stress. Positive stress is brief increases in our heart rate. We have an intensified focus. There's a mild elevation in our adrenaline and cortisol, our stress hormones, but it's very controllable. For instance, if I am getting ready to audition for competitive soccer, I might experience a little positive stress. If I'm at the side of, in the wings of a stage, getting ready to go out and perform in a dance recital, if I am in a room getting ready to take my ACT, I may have this positive stress, but that's actually kind of good for me. It will intensify my focus. It will allow me to access some of the parts of fight, flight, or freeze that might help me in that situation. The next level of stress or degree of stress we call tolerable stress. And tolerable stress is serious but temporary stress responses that might be mitigated by positive or buffering influences or relationships. So for instance, a level of tolerable stress might be that I've lost my job. I go to work, I find out I've lost my job. Now I'm worried about how I'm going to pay my rent. I'm worried about how I'm going to pay my bills. And so the stress is increased, but it's still tolerable. I can still call my mom and talk to my mom about the fact I just lost my job. Or I know that I might be getting some unemployment coming. And so I'm able to deal with it because there are some factors around that are allowing me to cope and deal. And then the last area or degree of stress is what we call toxic stress. And that's intense, prolonged activation of a stress response without those positive buffers, without those positive relationships. So for instance, a toxic level of stress might be, I'm in a relationship where there might be some domestic violence. And so I'm continually on edge in my relationship. I don't really have a way out of that relationship. I'm choosing not to talk about or share with that a relationship. Then that stress might increase to a toxic level. And so when we also talk about anxiety, what we're talking about is minimizing the amount of toxic stress that we have in our lives. So another way that we can look at anxiety, or I like to look at anxiety, my mom was a math teacher for many, many years. This makes her very proud because I look at it through an equation format. Oftentimes with kids, when we talk about anxiety, we want to talk about it or any mental health disorder in a way that a kid might be able to approach it or understand it. And so the way I like to look at anxiety is an emotion that's created when an individual is placed in a situation where they have a lot of stress, and they have a lot of fear, and they choose to hold that stress and fear inside, which means they don't talk about it or deal with it. And then over time, that stress and fear may turn into what we call anxiety. I think it's important that kids understand, or anyone understands, that anxiety just doesn't necessarily occur. Typically what happens is we've been triggered with a stress or we've been having a fear response, and we've dealt with that for a while. And this has come to pass. Now we have developed some anxiety. It's not wrong or bad to experience stress, fear, anxiety. We just have to learn how to deal with it. So where our journey is going to begin tonight into anxiety, we've got to talk about the fact that all emotional states are triggered. And that means happiness, sadness, stress, fear, anxiety, all emotional states are triggered. And before we can manage any dysfunctional emotion, we have to begin by identifying and understanding what triggers the emotion. So what's the underlying trigger that's causing that emotion? And so some common triggers for childhood anxiety might be school or family related problems. A kid's upset about not doing well on a test, or maybe they've gotten themselves in trouble at school, or like a discipline referral. Maybe it's family related problems. It may be issues and strain in a family system. Maybe it might even be a condition of divorce, might be a family related problem that might cause childhood anxiety. Social and peer pressures are also common triggers of childhood anxiety. Social media is a huge warehouse that can trigger anxiety in kids. And when we think about it in the way a kid can think about it, if I take a picture of my hamburger, and currently right now, current statistics say for my picture needs to be liked 1,000 times for me to feel like that I've achieved in a social media format. I don't know 1,000 people in my personal life. I certainly don't know 1,000 people that want to look at my hamburger. But for kids, they set these benchmarks for themselves. Oftentimes in social media, and especially as it deals with peer-related pressures, it may be someone comments about something, like maybe someone says my nose looks like Pinocchio's nose, and now I think everyone's talking about my Pinocchio nose. So social and peer-related pressures are two common triggers of childhood anxiety. Illness or a medical condition. Any child that struggles with an illness or a long-term medical condition could struggle with anxiety. A major life event or performance. Those are ACT tests. Those are I'm in my dance recital. I'm getting ready to be in the school play. Might be a major life event or performance. In the aftermath of a physical or an emotional trauma. I'm in a car accident. I'm in I was in Oklahoma at this time of year. I saw a tornado on TV, and now suddenly we're talking about tornadoes, or I might hear the tornado siren. Separation from a parent or a loved one. Anytime kiddos are separated from their primary supports, they may have struggle with anxiety. And the last one I put on here is lack of oxygen. And people oftentimes when I talk about anxiety, we'll say, well, lack of oxygen. Well, our current COVID situation we're in it has a barrier to oxygen. And so it is a normal human response when we struggle with oxygen or bringing in oxygen that we feel anxious or we're triggered. So that could be the current COVID situation that we were in, or even asthma or some sort of allergy related symptoms, some sort of condition that's impairing my ability to take in oxygen. All right. So I can't talk about anxiety without talking about locus of control. And so you're probably saying to yourself, well, what's locus of control? Well, locus of control basically is when I ask myself the question, what are the things I control and what are the things I don't control? And so when we talk about locus of control and anxiety, it's really important because we've talked about triggers. We need to determine what triggers do we control and what triggers do we not control. We can waste a lot of time and energy trying to cope and deal with triggers we don't control. For instance, every child in the state of Oklahoma will have to take the ACT test before they graduate from high school. We can't remove that trigger. And so if we spend a lot of time and energy focused on trying to remove that trigger, we're spending a lot of our emotional capital on something we can't really change. So really, we want to spend our energy and time on those things that we actually control and those triggers that we actually control. The cognitive triangle is a great emotional management technique that we can use to kind of determine for ourselves, what is it that we control and what is it that we don't control, and where are we going to choose to spend our energy. The cognitive triangle is the basic idea that an individual's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all interrelated. So the way I behave in a certain way is going to impact my thinking. My thinking is going to impact my feelings. My feelings are going to impact my thinking or my mindset and my behaviors. They're all interrelated. And our cognitive triangle spins. It spins in a positive direction when we're having a good day. One of those awesome days when we feel great and our thinking is very positive and our behaviors are positive. Unfortunately, though, on some days it might spin in a negative direction. We might feel terrible, or we might not have the best attitude. Our thinking may not be the best, or our behaviors, we may not be necessarily on our best behavior. And the important thing when we talk about managing emotions with a cognitive triangle is that we control it. these are the three things that we do control. We control how we feel, how we think, and how we behave. And so if my cognitive triangle is spinning in a positive direction, it tends to pick up speed in whatever direction it spins in. If it spins in a positive direction, awesome, my day's getting better and better. The problem is if it spins in a negative direction, my day's getting worse and worse. Sometimes kids have days that slide. I don't know what happened. It started out bad and it just got worse over the course of the day. Well, the interesting thing is when we look at our emotions through this cognitive triangle lens, typically people always want to feel better. As a counselor, people rarely come to me and say, "Hey, I feel great, but I want you to work on a certain behavior," or "I feel great, but I just thought, we might have a discussion about my mindset about something." Typically, when people come to counseling, they will say, "I feel terrible. I feel overwhelmed. I feel helpless. I feel very lost in that situation." And unfortunately, feeling is the hardest of the three to fix and change. Feeling's an internal job. I can tell myself all day long, be happy, Sheila, be calm, be calm, be calm. And that's a really hard thing to change. The interesting thing is because they're all interrelated, if I want to impact my feelings, I can do it far more quickly and far more effectively and efficiently if I look at the other two areas. For instance, simple behavior change can impact the way I feel because they're all interrelated. So I don't feel very well today. I feel down and depressed. I feel overwhelmed. I feel anxious. But a behavior change, for instance, going out and walking the dog or doing some exercise or getting up and having breakfast might impact the way I feel. If I can't find a positive behavior, then I always want to focus on my thinking and my mindset. I tell kids all the time, if you think you can do something, you can do it. If you think you can't do something, you can't. And so oftentimes when we're feeling negative, the best way to improve the way we feel is by focusing on those other areas that we control, like our thoughts and our behavior. All right. So we talked a little bit about focusing on what we can control. But then we have to talk about how do we assess where we are when it comes to anxiety and when it comes to any negative emotion. And so a scale that I like to use, a pretty simple scale, there are a ton of assessments out there you can do, but a pretty simple scale that you can utilize, or an assessment tool you can utilize on almost a daily basis, would be what we call the Sud Scale. And Sud stands for Subjective Understanding of Distress Scale. And it's a simple emotional thermometer. It works just like a regular thermometer. And it can help me measure how intense a situation is or where I am emotionally at any given time. And if we look at the Sud Scale here in front of us, down at the bottom, 0, 1, 2, or 3, is what I like to refer to as our chill zone. When I'm at the bottom of my Sud Scale, I'm calm, I'm relaxed. I might be doing a pleasurable activity. I might be laying on the couch. I might be watching the TV, and I have my little dog next to me rubbing her soft, silky ears. It might be right before I go to sleep at night. I've got my Cool Max pillow that's cold on both sides, no matter what. My soft, fuzzy blanket. I'm calm and I'm relaxed. I'm at a 0, 1, 2, or 3 on my Sud Scale. As we work up our Sud Scale, the next area we go to is 4, 5, and 6. And we call 4, 5, and 6 our work zone. As one of the previous slides indicated, that as human beings, we are able to deal with stress, positive stressors, and even tolerable stressors. And it would be unrealistic to think we will not have those types of things in our life. And so 4, 5, and 6 is that zone where we might be doing an activity that's not completely calm and relaxing to us, but at the same time, we have a handle on it. It might be difficult, but we still still feel like we're in control, or maybe we're starting to get uncomfortable, but we feel like we're still in control. 8, 9, or 10 at the top of our Sud Scale, I like to call it the out of control zone. Growing up, I have a brother who's 5 years younger than I am, and that we struggled over ownership of the back seat. We actually had a line in the back seat of our wood paneled station wagon that this was my side and this is your side, and never the side should meet. And my brother often would take his finger and touch the line, or maybe take it right over the line. And I could feel it. I mean, he's on my side of the back seat. What is he doing, right? Or sometimes he would take his finger and he would almost touch me, but not really touch me. And I could feel it inside. When I am at 8, 9, or 10, what's going to happen is typically I'm going to react in some sort of way. My fist just reaches out and I punch the brother. I don't think about the fact, oh, my mom pulled off the side of the road, I'm going to get the mom lecture again for punching my brother. I don't think about, ooh, I just lost, playing video games, or I lost some activity I want, because I'm in my out of control zone. I'm just reactive at that point. My arm reaches out and I punch him before I even think about the fact that I punched him. Only later do I hear my mom go, ah, right, because I'm in out of control zone. Important number on our Sud scale. The number 7 is the last number that I'm in control. So if my brother's in the car poking me with his finger, I still have control at my fist at a 7. I could talk to my fist. I could say, fist, do not hit the brother. He wants to be punched, but don't punch him. Or I could use my voice and ask my mom for help. I may be very activated, but I'm still not to the point that I'm reactive. I still have a level of control. So it's important to know for kids to begin to understand where they are in a given, kids that struggle with anxiety, where are you on any given day? It will help us to know where the triggers are. If I tend to be an 8, 9, or 10 right before I walk into school, then school may be a trigger for me. Right before I go to bed at night, if I feel, instead of being down in my chill zone, if I'm toward the top of my Sud scale, then we might look at what around that time is causing that trigger. So it's a simple thing to do. If you're searching to figure out what's triggering an individual, do it a couple times a day. And typically you'll begin to see a pattern. Everything was great until recess, but when I went back in the classroom after recess, when we do reading, I tend to feel at the top of my Sud scale. So then we can, when we work with kids, we can say, well, maybe reading is an area that is a trigger for that child. Childhood anxiety versus adult anxiety. Due to the nature of the developing brain and how long it takes the upstairs brain or our frontal cortex to develop, kids struggle in identifying and verbalizing and expressing their anxiety. So I hate to tell you all this, but your child's brain won't fully develop till they're about 25 or 26 years old. And it will the brain hits peak performance about 33 to 35. And unfortunately, every day that goes by and I get older, I hate this, my brain is slowly winding down over time. So until that frontal cortex is developed enough, kids really struggle in identifying or verbalizing or expressing triggers. We may have to help them with that. It's not they're going to say, oh, reading is a trigger. We'll have to help them with that process. Oftentimes children struggling with anxiety are more apt to report how they're feeling. They may say, I feel terrible. Oftentimes they will report physical symptoms. I'm sick. My head hurts really bad. Oh, my muscles ache. They might more than report being able to generalize that feeling, that physical feeling, to a particular trigger or particular emotion. So what are symptoms of childhood anxiety? Pretty typically, children struggling with anxiety will struggle with nightmares and disturbed sleep. When we have high levels of adrenaline and cortisol in our bodies, it's very hard for us to maintain a sleep schedule and enter REM sleep states. And so oftentimes kids struggling with anxiety will struggle to go to sleep at night and struggle to stay asleep at night. Oftentimes they are on alert. And so, you're laying next to them, you've read them a story, you think they're asleep, and you get up off the bed to leave the room and they're immediately 100% awake. They're like, where are you going? And you're like, and part of that could be due to anxiety. they may be restless, or they may have difficulty concentrating or maintaining attention to task. Sometimes, unfortunately, ADD and ADHD may be misdiagnosed symptoms of anxiety. Kids that struggle with anxiety because of the amount of adrenaline and cortisol, the factor in fight, flight, or freeze, can access that frontal cortex of their brain and do report feeling. You can see them there. They look restless. They really struggle with that attention to task. And then the last two, they may be irritable, and there may be tantrums and crying. So oftentimes you will see it will come out or fighting with a sibling. There'll be a heightened aggression to it from time to time in certain kids. So now that we kind of know what it looks like, we know kind of how to measure it, we kind of know what the brain processes that are involved in fight, flight, or freeze and that deal with anxiety, we have to ask ourselves, when we're going to help our kiddos, we need to look at, is it the body that's being most affected? Are we finding out, are they shaking? Are they crying? Are they reporting stomach aches or headaches? Or is it more the mind? Are they struggling with ruminating thoughts? Do they find themselves becoming negative over time? So which of the two is the most impacted? Or it sometimes can be a combination of both. And you're probably asking yourself, well, okay, so Sheila, why is it important for me to know which from which? Well, we can more effectively deal with anxiety if we can determine which component of that is most impacted in ourselves. If it's body symptoms, I'm going to use a certain group of strategies. If it's more my attitude toward things, I'm going to use a different set of strategies. And so this allows us the opportunity to select the most appropriate coping strategy that we have in the particular situation. And definitely we want to select those strategies that are effective. Oftentimes, people that are struggling with anxiety don't have a lot of patience. And so if I select a strategy that doesn't work, they'll immediately then give up. I tried it and it didn't work. And so we're going to talk a little bit about body symptomology that might happen when somebody is struggling with anxiety. There is not one system of the body that isn't impacted by anxiety. Your central nervous system, your cardiovascular system. When we're anxious, our blood pressure rises, our pulse rate rises. Our digestive system, we produce more digestive enzymes. We become nauseous. We can develop symptomology like GERD and have digestive issues. Our immune system's impacted. A ton of research out there about the fact that people that struggle with anxiety, our bone marrow actually doesn't make as many white blood cells when we are triggered with anxiety than it does when we are more in a calm state. Our respiratory system, we don't breathe the same way. We do this chest breathing rather than using our diaphragm and taking in more oxygen. And there are a host of other somatic effects. People report headaches. Sometimes people report migrating pains, like my legs might hurt or my back might hurt, just because I've been triggered and I'm anxious. So if somebody, if we're dealing with a child or even another adult that's reporting body symptomology, what are some strategies that we might enlist to help that person? We might spend some time focusing on breathing. Breathing when somebody's struggling with the body impacts of anxiety is the easiest way to calm the body down, to get the body down into a different zone, a work zone or a chill zone, to pull them out of that out of control zone. There are a ton of great breathing strategies out there. At your child's particular school, I know they do star breathing, works really well. Any type of breathing where what we're looking for is that for the inhaled breath, for the exhale breath to be doubled what the inhale breath is. So for instance, I may breathe into the count of 2 and hold it. And when I exhale, I'm going to stretch that exhale breath to the count of 4. And what that literally does in my brain, just in a couple of breaths, it's like it opens that door to my frontal cortex, to the upstairs part of my brain. Other good breathing strategies, there's one called a 4-7-8. And what you do is you breathe in for 4, you hold it for 7, and you exhale and stretch the exhale breath for 8. I will tell you that those breaths that you take, the 4-7-8, sometimes can make an individual sleepy. So if you're struggling with a little bit of anxiety, I would not do the 4-7-8 while you drive because it tends to make you a little bit more tired. Other ways that you might be able to help when anxiety is impacting the body, any type of exercise, short walks or exercise breaks. We don't have to go to the gym and work out for long periods of time, but just taking the dog for a walk around the block, an exercise break, getting up, doing a couple jumping jacks, anything like that to allow us to start that conversation back with our body, grounds us. Staying hydrated is important. We are one of the most dehydrated societies out there. We put a lot of junk, liquid junk in our bodies and not a lot of water. 8 ounces of water, that's the little bitty tiny bottles of water that you have at Sam's, will hydrate the body enough that it will decrease, it cuts cortisol, dissolves cortisol in the body by 50%, just 8 ounces of water. So if you see your child starting to get upset, giving them a glass of water or ice chips to kind of suck on will help because it hydrates the body. Eating healthy, balanced meals and snacks. Sometimes, especially in kids, anxiety will creep in when our blood sugar is not stable. And so it's really important that healthy, balanced snacking and those healthy, balanced meals are important if we're going to control the impact of anxiety in a body. Along with that, this one makes my heart hurt, limit the intake of sugar and caffeine. And I'm not saying to cut it out entirely, but if you have a child in your household that's really struggling with anxiety, you really want to look at how much sugar and caffeine is that child partaking in at any given time. And if it's a little bit high, then to make sure that you reduce those levels. Aromatherapy is another great way, and when anxiety is impacting the body, when I can't catch my breath and I feel a little bit nauseous. Sometimes just a certain smell might help. Aromatherapy tends to work because the sense of smell is our only sense that's loaded directly into memory, which is why when you smell cookies, you think of grandma. And so when we pair smells with positive situations in our brain, when we make positive associations, it will help calm the body. One of my favorite stories about this is I love Bath and Body Works. It's one of my favorite places. I went there to buy a gift this past fall in the height of the pandemic. And as I was checking out, they had the sale table, and on the sale table, they had a bottle of Calm lotion. And I thought, well, that's what I need for $3.99. I need some Calm. And so I purchased the Calm lotion. I went direct to my car. I put it on my hands, and it was lovely. The minute I smelled it, I was just, I was definitely in the lower ranges of my Sud Scale. I was like, oh, I need another bottle of Calm. So I get out of my car, I go in, they only have 2 bottles of Calm. I think, great. So I'm using Calm at work. I have a bottle of Calm in my car, a bottle of Calm at work. And then I think, well, I may need a bottle of Calm for home. And so I went to, not the Edmond Bath and Body Works. I went to the one over by Memorial, by Quail Springs. And I walked in to get my bottle of Calm, and I'm looking around the store, and the little sales girl goes, what are you looking for? And I said, Calm. And she tells me that they have discontinued Calm. And I was like, you discontinued Calm in the middle of a pandemic? Seriously? And so, but those aromatherapies, if your child has a scent they really like, peppermint, they have a lavender, anything like that, you can use that and it will help their body stay calm. Engaging in progressive relaxation or yoga exercises. There are a ton of different yoga instructors that if you have a child that really struggles with anxiety, that do kid-friendly yoga. There's a ton of YouTube videos out there that incorporate kid-friendly yoga, or progressive relaxation where we're just tightening and releasing muscle groups. Also happens helps when a person's struggling with anxiety. Be mindful of body posture. So power stances, we're looking to be big in space, is really important. There's a professor, I think from Princeton, named Sarah Cuddy, that has a TED Talk that talks about our body posture. The larger we are in space, the more testosterone we have and the more confident we feel. So anytime that we can be big in space is important. Utilizing fidget objects. I'm a big believer, any kind of fidget objects that you can put on a pencil, anything that grounds us in that moment. Bouncing a ball, your heart rate will go along to a beat. So listening to music that has a slow beat to it, or bouncing a ball a slow way, or back and forth with a child, are a great way to decrease the heart rate. Setting regular sleep schedules or incorporating short nap breaks. If you're struggling to set a consistent sleep schedule at home, then look for ways to incorporate short nap breaks. You're going to lay down for 15 minutes after school and take a nap. You can use some diet supplements, but please make sure you check with a physician first before you do that. But there is some people use melatonin. Lemon balm is one that is used from time to time. Any kind of omega-3 fatty acids, green tea and dark chocolate are some that you could utilize, but because we're working with children, always check with your pediatrician first. So those are some ways you might help anxiety in the body. So what do you do if you have a child or you're struggling with anxiety and it's thoughts? You have racing thoughts, you can't get to sleep at night. And what that might look like, you might have a preoccupation with negative thoughts and negative thinking patterns. You might be hypervigilant. You might be waiting for the next bad thing to happen. You might not have ability to cope with irrational fears. You might not understand that that you may believe that a B or a C on your spelling test will ruin your future from now on. You might not be able to understand that you're in the 4th grade. Most jobs aren't based off your 4th grade spelling grade. You might have short-term and long-term memory dysfunctions. It might impact it. You can't remember what you need to remember. And then communication is broken down in social connectivity. When our mind becomes very active with feelings of anxiety, we oftentimes don't want to connect socially with others. We would rather withdraw from situations. We lose a motivation. We don't want to complete tasks. We have a hard time getting started for things. Sometimes we'll procrastinate. We will report sometimes feeling inadequate or helpless or hopeless in certain situations. So what happens if I'm dealing with this? My child doesn't report any physical anxiety symptoms, but we have a ton of mental anxiety symptoms. We're struggling with remaining positive, or we're really hypervigilant in situations, or we can't stop the mind. The very first thing that we want to do to help is first we want to turn the focus on facts rather than emotional states. Sometimes kids believe that our emotions are facts, and they're really not. Our emotions are our perceptions. So what are the facts of the situations? If I'm really upset about the fact that I made a B on this spelling test, what are some ways maybe my teacher will let me redo part of it? So focus on the facts of the situation. Help them cross-examine the thinking pattern. So lots of T-charts, for instance, in problematic situations, like, what we can control in the situation, and really look at it with eyes from outside. Sometimes challenge the reason for the fear. So sometimes kids will struggle to be assertive and challenge it. So we need to walk them through that process and model challenging the reason for the fear. Promote engagement in enjoyable hobbies or other creative activities. Anytime that we're creative, we're automatically accessing that frontal part of our cortex. So anything that we can do that are any kind of creative art, dance, singing, any kind of creative activities, or even hobbies, sports that we like to do, automatically resets and primes the mind to be more positive. Find the funny and try to laugh. There's no funnier laboratory, no more humor, better humor laboratory for kids than kids. If you've got kids, there's something probably to laugh with 50 times a day. So whatever's funny out there, if we can get them to laugh, watching YouTube videos, dogs running with buckets on their head, or cat fails, any laughter derails the mind from feelings of anxiety. Chunking helps. So anytime we can chunk our day into small, manageable portions. Assignments, if we can chunk assignments in small, manageable. We have a book report due, so we're going to do this part tonight and this part next, helps. Creating daily gratitude journals are important too. A big study came out of Johns Hopkins University, where they took a large group of people struggling with symptoms of anxiety, like 1,400 or 1,500. They split them in multiple groups. One group they gave a gym membership to, and said, go work out for 6 months, so many times a week. One group they sent to a physician, and they were actually put on psychotropic medication to kind of help them with their anxiety symptoms. One group went to cognitive behavioral counseling, which is a group I knew was going to do better than any other group because I'm a counselor. And then one group, they actually gave them an 89-cent spiral notebook from like Walmart. And they said, we want you to go home, and every day in this notebook, we want you to write 3 positive things every day. And after 6 months, they got back together, and the group that reported better relationships, better health, better mindsets, better emotional regulation was not the group that went to the gym, was not the group that got the medication through their physician. Unfortunately, was not even the group that had cognitive behavioral counseling. It was the group that got the 89-cent journal. And so creating moments of gratitude in your family will help your kiddos. So a gratitude board on the refrigerator, anything like that will help. Always use forward focused language and model positive self-talk. Get rid of can'ts and focus on I cans. I used to, when I was an elementary school counselor, do car pickup. And one of the things that I always was fascinated about was the conversation that occurs in the pickup line at school. Kids that tend to be, and this is anecdotal, but kids that tend to be more positive have those parents that the first thing that when they get in the car tend to try to focus on the positive things for school. And so would be, tell me what's the one best thing that happened at school today, rather than, having the kid get in the car and tell the multitude of negative that might have happened to them. Teach the art of reframing. There used to be an old Disney movie called Pollyanna that she always looked at the positive. So reframing is taking those negative events and finding those positive portions. And that's a modeled skill that we can do for kids. When I reframe in my life in front of a kid, then that helps them know that they have that ability to do that too. Use the buddy system. It's really important when kids struggle with anxiety, who can they trust at school? Who can they turn to at school? Who's a trusted friend they can talk to, or a family member that can help them with problem solving? So help your kids buddy up in certain and identify those individuals, because when I'm at the top of my Sud scale, I may not be able to do that for myself. So it's really important to already know, when I start feeling like this, where do I turn to? Now, before we go on and look at everyday anxiety versus possible anxiety disorders, I do want to talk about the fact that it's really important for any strategy to work, it to be implemented at the right time. For instance, I cannot implement a strategy when I am at the top part of my Sud scale. At an 8, 9, or 10, I cannot implement that strategy. As a matter of fact, if you try to get me to implement the strategy at 8, 9, or 10, I will go further into fight, flight, or freeze. It's really important that I implement those strategies when I am at a 7. I'm not, or maybe even when I feel myself starting to get to the top of my work zone. I'm at a 6. So it's really important, not only the strategy we use, but when we implement it. Oftentimes in therapy, when I'm working with individuals that are struggling with anxiety, I'll give them a strategy and they'll say, oh, the other day, the whole day went south. I was in trouble in the office and I was trying to breathe, and that breathing doesn't work. Well, you should have started breathing way back prior to getting to the office. When whatever happened on the playground, you should have started breathing at that point. So it's when we implement the strategy that's important. So oftentimes in crisis situations, when I talk to people, they're like, well, how do I know the difference between everyday anxiety and that maybe my child has an anxiety disorder? So what's the difference? Everyday anxiety, you're worried, you have kids worried about grades, tests, family relationships, or life events. An anxiety disorder would be constant, unsubstantiated worry that causes significant daily distress. Kids that get really hung up on everybody's talking about me, or that, my grades, I'm always failing, and there's the grades coming home that are all good, might be an anxiety disorder. Everyday anxiety might be embarrassment or self-consciousness, and or not being comfortable in social situations. An anxiety disorder would be, I avoid all social situations. I'm worried about I'm going to be judged or embarrassed or humiliated. So I don't want to participate in soccer. I don't want to go to dance anymore. I'm avoiding social situations due to fear. Everyday anxiety might be a realistic fear of a dangerous object, place, or situation. Anxiety disorder would be an irrational fear or avoidance of an object, place, or situation that poses little or no threat or danger. In this one, I'll talk a little bit about tornadoes in Oklahoma. I mean, that's a realistic fear. When we're in tornado season and the sky gets green David Payne is getting out the Gettner. I mean, we should have a realistic fear of that. However, if I'm having that irrational fear, it's like the sky's blue and there's no storms anywhere, and I still have that intense fear, that could be an anxiety disorder. Nervousness, sweating before a big event, presentation, or performance. That's that positive stress. We're going to feel that way. However, if I have reoccurring nightmares, flashbacks, or I shut down, I in that fight, flight, or freeze, I freeze up, and that event becomes more of a traumatic event that I can't keep from talking about it. I can't let it go. It could be that I'm struggling with an anxiety disorder. So when do you seek professional help? So at what point do you say, I'm really concerned? And I will tell this to parents all the time. You are you know your child better than anyone. And so when you begin to see behaviors that concern you, it's always great to reach out for a professional and talk to a professional. Oftentimes I look at mental health disorders. If we looked at them like cavities, if I have a part of my mouth that when I'm eating hot soup is a little tender, or when I eat ice kind of hurts a little bit, if I go to the dentist then and have them look at it, they may say, oh, it's just a little sensitivity. Or they may say, Sheila, you have a little cavity. If I wait until my jaw is throbbing and I can't eat anything in that situation, what will happen when I go to the dentist, more significant type of procedure will have to be done. It's the same way with any sort of mental health disorder, or someone that might be struggling with symptoms that might lead us to believe they have a mental health disorder. The earlier we intervene, the better. And so, kind of red flags if your child has had a history of previous anxiety issues. So they've had separation anxiety when they were small at school that was pretty significant. If they're experiencing any sort of panic episodes or attacks, when we're dealing with kids that are actually having panic episodes or having panic attacks, they can't stop crying, they can't catch their breath. It would be a great idea to seek some professional help for that child. Significant disruptions in sleep, appetite, activities, and social or family relationships. And this is a great area that parents who know their kids, significant for one child may look different than significant for another child. I may have a child that does not like to really, my brother's like this, he doesn't really like being social. And so, if he didn't want to go do something at school, my mom would have to look at some other areas. She'd be like, oh, he's just being himself. When I didn't want to go to school and participate, my mom was like, what's wrong with you? Are you not feeling well? Like, what's going on? Because I tended to be more social. So kids, even in a family system, this will look different. Or if the anxiety is ever accompanied by depression or suicidal thoughts. I look at depression and suicide and suicidal thoughts and anxiety. Depression is like, and anxiety are like a little married couple. Where there's one, there's typically the other. It's just one often is louder than the other. So if your child is really struggling with anxiety, it wouldn't be uncommon for there to be some low-grade depression or maybe significant depression symptoms. So those are things to think about. All right, so that's my presentation for this evening. I'm going to stop the sharing